All right, very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another webinar event organized by the Adam Smith Center in Singapore. We are Singapore's first and only organization promoting pro-business, pro-market classical liberal values. So first of all, I just want to thank different participating organizations. So first of all, the SMU Economics Intelligence Club Executive Committee, Ryan, Daniel, and Bhavya, thanks very much for participating. So the NTU Economics Society as well, thank you very much for collaborating with us. My friend Max Marlowe from LSE Hayek Society, as well as Johannes, KCL Libertarian Society. And I just want to thank Ms. Sandra Tan as well from the Dean's Office in SMU for your liaison on this. So for today's webinar, our speaker, who is Professor Chandran Kukathas, he will be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which I'll be moderating a question and answer session. So we'll end at about 6:30 p.m. sharp. So please drop your questions along the way. You can drop them anytime along the way in the Q&A function at the very bottom. And besides the Q&A function, there is also a function on polls. There is a poll which I've just started. So it's a question I'm just throwing out to everyone here. Should the government ever restrict immigration? And if so, for what reason? Right? So we'll just let people vote on this question, right? And we'll just have some discussion on this. So today's webinar is on the topic of immigration, which is an issue that attracts a diversity of opinions, right? There are some people who are more averse to the inflow of foreigners into a nation, but some people are more open to the inflow of foreigners into a country. Just an interesting point of information, just last month in Singapore, the IPS released a survey which shows that most Singaporeans, especially older Singaporeans, are quite averse to the inflow of foreigners into Singapore. So what do we make about this? So today our speaker is actually Professor Chandran Kukathas. Let me just introduce him for a few moments. He's the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University. He was previously from the London School of Economics, and he's actually a world-renowned political theorist, having written numerous journal articles and books. One of my favorites is actually the book called The Liberal Archipelago, which I highly recommend. He's also an advisory board member at the Adam Smith Center, which is my organization. So without further ado, Professor, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you and the various societies for inviting me and making this occasion possible. So I've been given the title, People Without Borders, for my talk, with the subtitle, Immigration and Freedom. The book that I've just published, here's a copy of it from Princeton University Press, available on Amazon and all good booksellers. The title of my book, Immigration and Freedom, is really the title of this talk. But I like the expression People Without Borders because it brings to light really the underlying theme of my talk and more generally of my thinking about immigration, which is that immigration really is about people. And I think it's something that policy too frequently forgets. Consider this particular quotation from the Swiss dramatist Max Frisch. He wrote in the foreword to a book that he was introducing as follows: "We asked for workers and got people instead." What he has in mind here in this expression is really quite simple. Governments, to some extent, corporations and other organizations really do want workers. And in their search for workers across the labor market, both domestically and abroad, they sometimes forget that workers are actually people. And that means that they aren't just factors of production, but they come with all the things that people have. They've got their own health conditions, they've got friends, they've got relatives, they've got parents, some of whom may be getting elderly, they have attachments, they've got commitments. So when you look for workers, you have to expect to get people, but it's something that all kinds of organizations, and notably governments, forget. And we'll come back to this in my presentation. But let me say a little bit then about how I want to proceed with the talk that I'm going to give you now. And I'll begin by saying something about the basic thesis of this talk. My book is called Immigration and Freedom, as is this subject here today, because what I want to get at is a concern that many people have when it comes to immigration, both in the developed West, but to some extent also in other countries. People are anxious about freedom, particularly in liberal democracies, because they think that immigration poses a danger or a threat to the host society. In particular, they feel that it's a danger to the values of that society. And what I want to suggest in my presentation to you today is that there is a danger, but there's a greater danger in immigration control that people have not really appreciated. Because if you want to control immigration, you will have to do something, do many things that will have a great bearing on the fundamental values of your society. And this is because ultimately, if you want to control immigration, what you'll have to do is firstly control those who are looking to move into your society. But secondly, and more importantly, you're going to have to control your own people. Because if you understand immigration correctly, well, it's really not simply about controlling people crossing the border, because most people who cross the border aren't actually immigrants. They're probably just visitors. They're tourists. They're pilots who are stopping over before they fly off again. There are all kinds of people who cross the border who are not immigrants. But what immigration control is about is controlling not people crossing the border, at least not primarily. It's about controlling what people do once they have crossed the border. And to do that, you have to stop them from doing things you don't want, like taking a job, renting a house, opening a bank account, starting a business, teaching, maybe even forming friendships with other people. And to do this, you've got to control your own population, because your own population is all too likely to try to hire these people or to do business with them, or to enroll them in a university, or to rent to them, or to help them open a bank account, or do all kinds of things which are simply a part of the normal business of engaging with other people. Usually when we are looking for something, whether it's something practical, like a business engagement, or something more personal, we don't ask first where someone is from. We ask who they are, what are they like, what can they do? So in order to control immigrants, you have to control your own citizens. And the argument I want to put to you is that controlling your own citizens means a loss of freedom for your own citizens, and it will probably mean also a loss with respect to your other institutions. And the more seriously you try to control outsiders, the more you will have to control insiders. So that's the basic thesis of today's presentation. And I'm going to present this more fully in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to go over the definitional problems that underpin a lot of this analysis. I'm going to say something about why freedom is endangered, and then something about why other institutional values like the rule of law are also endangered. In the second part, I'll consider some objections to my thesis, in particular, the arguments that say, well, this may all be true, but so what? At least there are gains we're making, economic gains, for example, or gains in the protection of our cultural values, or perhaps simply the gain that we enjoy by being in control of our own destiny. And what I want to say is that none of these gains are actually as substantial as people think, if they're indeed gains at all. But let me begin with the definitional problem. So if you want to control immigration, the first thing to ask is, what is an immigrant? Now, this may seem like a straightforward enough matter, but in fact, a little investigation tells you that it's actually a bit more complicated and indeed, in some ways, altogether confusing. According to the United Nations, an immigrant is someone who's outside his or her country of residence, or rather of nationality, for 12 months or longer. Now, this immediately raises an obvious question. Well, why 12 months? Why not say 6 months? Now, if you said 6 months, then you've suddenly got a lot more immigrants than you thought, because people who are with you for more than 6 months will be immigrants. But what if you made it 2 years? Well, if someone came for 2 years in order to be an immigrant, well, that means that you've got many fewer immigrants than you have right now. Now, this may seem like a bit of quibbling, but it actually has a substantial bearing on a lot of debates and discussions. In the UK, for example, over the last decade, various governments have promised to cut down migration. At one stage, the Conservative government under Mr. Cameron said they were going to reduce immigration numbers from 300,000 to 100,000. But it all depends on what you count as an immigrant. For example, do you count students as immigrants? Well, in one way they don't, because if they come for less than a year, they clearly can't count as immigrants. But if they stay a bit longer to do a 4-year degree or a 3-year degree, do they count as immigrants? Well, the government and the opposition have gone back and forth on this question because they don't agree. If you add students, then the immigrant numbers go up. If you take away students, they go down. How are we to count these? So there is no natural definition of an immigrant. An immigrant is, in fact, just someone who is so declared to be by government policy. And even then, for example, if we took the United Kingdom, there is no official definition of an immigrant. In fact, and in UK law, there is only the category of persons with indefinite leave to remain in the United Kingdom. It's simply a matter of whether you have a right to remain, but it doesn't say anything about what exactly is an immigrant. But this brings me to a slightly different problem, which is what exactly is the opposite of an immigrant? So one obvious answer to give is that it's a native, or if you like, a national of a country. But what exactly is a national? Because it seems like it's simply the obverse of an immigrant. But here again, we get into a number of difficulties. It all depends on definition. We simply decide what is a national, what is a native. When I say we, I don't even mean the population as a whole. I mean, governments determine this in one way or another. But at the same time, they don't have a consistent definition of a native or a national. Definitions of this have changed over the years. And in fact, this brings me really to the crucial point. When it comes to immigration and immigration control, although the argument is usually made that it's necessary in order to protect or defend the interests of natives or nationals, what in fact happens from the very beginning is that a determination is made about who is a native and who is a national. And that means the beginning of immigration control is not, in fact, border control. The beginning of immigration control is definition or classification. Now, once again, this may seem like a rather technical set of claims, but let me give it some historical reality. Let's take the United Kingdom to start with. Now, it did not have a category of citizen, for example, until 1948. In 1946, a guy called Freddie Mercury was born. His name was not Freddie Mercury at the time, he was Farouk Bulsara. He was born in Zanzibar to Parsi parents. who moved to the United Kingdom. Now, they moved without needing a visa or without needing any official permission because they were British subjects. In fact, they were British nationals because they were citizens, not even citizens, they were just subjects of the Queen in the British Empire. And in fact, most elderly Singaporeans here, in fact, really anyone who was born before 1955, was at that point a subject of the British Empire, and at that time had the right of abode in the United Kingdom. And this was true for the peoples of many different parts of the world. In fact, you could say, and a person no less significant than the British MP Enoch Powell in the 1960s recognized that at that time there were 800 million people in the world who had the right of residence in the United Kingdom because they were British subjects. If you like, they were British nationals. So what happened? Well, what happened was that over a number of years between 1948 and 1983, the claims of various people across the Commonwealth were gradually changed by British law to exclude them from membership of Great Britain. They were turned, in effect, into potential immigrants, whereas before that, they were not potential immigrants because they had the right of abode. So immigration control really begins with this process of classification. Now, I won't belabor this point, but I can tell you that the same holds in the United States, for example, where if you go back a century, for example, whether or not you're a citizen depended not just on your country of birth, but also on your marital status. If an American woman married a foreigner, she lost her American nationality. She ceased to be American. The laws have also changed over time with respect to who had the right to pass on their nationality. So, for example, even in 1982, a British woman who got who had children to a foreign man could not pass on her nationality. Her children would not be British, although a British man, if he married a foreign woman, could pass on his nationality. What has changed? What has changed is simply the law. The law defines who is a native and who is a potential immigrant. So this is where immigration control begins. But the next point I want to make is that we need to reinforce this point that it's not only not a matter of controlling classification, it's also a matter of controlling something other than borders. It's a matter of controlling what people do once they enter a country, and that means controlling citizens, controlling employers to make sure they don't employ the wrong persons, controlling landlords to make sure they don't rent to the wrong persons, controlling banks so that they don't let the wrong people open up accounts, which is not to say that everyone is prevented from engaging with immigrants, from renting to immigrants, or from doing business with them. What it means is that states then are selective about who among its citizens are allowed to trade, to do business, to engage with, to marry, to befriend outsiders. This is why I want to emphasize that immigration control is significant for us because it's really a control not on outsiders, but on insiders. And moreover, it's a control that on the one hand puts everybody under surveillance and monitoring, but on the other hand, it also selectively privileges some citizens over others. It allows some citizens to do what's of advantage to them, and it denies other citizens the opportunity to take advantage of precisely those chances that are available to others. So if we want to understand immigration and immigration control, we should understand it firstly as something that begins with classification, and secondly, that it's something that involves control and control over citizens, control over the residents of a society, not simply over outsiders. Now, in all of this, you might be thinking, well, so what I'm going to advocate now as an alternative is something that people think of as open borders. And let me say to you at this point, that's not what I'm going to argue for. I'm sympathetic to that idea, but I don't think that's necessarily the most helpful way to think about this, because that presumes that we simply understand what an open border could be. But I don't think that's actually particularly clear, particularly given my own thesis about the nature of immigration control. So let me say something then about what I understand by a border and what I understand by the openness or closedness of a border. And the point I want to make here is that borders are not simply open or closed. They are open or closed to a degree. Very, very few places are completely closed. North Korea is probably the closest we can come to in thinking about such a society. But no country is completely open in the sense that there are simply no checks or controls on people's movement across borders. But the openness or closeness of a border depends not simply on whether or not you can enter a country, because if you think of immigration control as primarily about controlling what people do when they enter a country, then you can make a border more or less open, not only by making it possible for people to physically enter a territory, but you can also make the country more open, the borders more open, by allowing them to participate in the life of that country by taking a job, for example, or renting a property, or setting up a business, or doing any of a range of things. The extent to which you're free to do that is a measure of how open your border is. If your border is open to someone who wants to enter as a worker, but the rules also forbid that worker to bring his or her spouse, then that border is less closed because it's less possible for you to enter. If you can enter, but you can only take a job above a certain pay or below a certain pay, again, your opportunities are limited and the border is less open to you. A border is also less open to you if you can enter and you can participate, but you can't ever become a member. You can't become a citizen. There's no path for you to that. That again makes it less interesting, less enticing, less valuable, an attempt that you want to make in actually crossing that particular boundary. So here are these three things that are ways in which you might consider the openness or closeness of the border. Does it allow you to enter? Does it allow you to take part in the life of the society? Does it allow you to become a member of that society? And there are so many different possibilities. If you consider this table, imagine society one. Yes, you can enter. Yes, you can get a job. Yes, you can become a citizen. That looks very open. If you look at society four, no, you can't enter. No, you can't participate. No, you can't become a member. Well, that's very, very closed. Think of society two. You can enter, you can participate, but you can't ever become a member, or it's very difficult. That's less open. Society three is even less open. You can enter as a tourist, but you can't do anything else. But there are also more complex possibilities. For example, country five, you can't enter, you can't participate, but you might sneak in nonetheless and live your life there and eventually be given amnesty. In which case, yes, that's a bit more open than other societies. Or consider society six, you're not allowed to enter, but you do in fact enter, and they don't monitor things too well, so you do in fact end up maybe buying a house, maybe getting work, and eventually becoming a citizen. Or imagine, number 7, a society which allows you to enter but forbids you to participate by getting a job, for example, but you do so anyway. No one detects you, and eventually you become a citizen. Well, that country is a bit more open than some others, a bit more closed than others. Here's another way of thinking about it. Country A may make it very easy to enter, hard to participate, very hard to become a member. But country B may make it very hard to enter, or hard to enter, very hard to get a job, but very easy once you've succeeded to become a citizen. Or others may make it very hard to get permission to enter. If you can enter, they allow you to work, but they still don't want you to become citizens. It's all a matter of degree. And my point here is that it doesn't make sense simply to ask, do we want open borders or closed borders? Because my question is, well, in what respect and how easy or how hard do you want this to be? But immigration control, ultimately, I want to say, is about controlling citizens. What it is about is controlling not just what immigrants or would-be immigrants do, and to a significant extent, most would-be immigrants who are denied the freedom to enter actually experience very little loss of freedom, because once they're denied that opportunity to move, that's the end of the story. But for citizens, the control is permanent, because once society has decided that it's going to limit immigration by controlling what would-be immigrants do once they've entered a society, it will have to set up mechanisms for constantly controlling, regulating, and monitoring their own citizens to make sure that they don't wittingly or unwittingly undermine the goals of policy. And once again, I think it's worth noting that citizens are all too ready to, in fact, associate with outsiders, because usually it's to their advantage. People in business want workers. They want people in the labor market. And very often it's difficult to find the people they want or they need among their own citizens. People within a country want their friends to enter. They want relatives to come. They want to have friendships and associations with people from other parts of the world. All of that will have to be controlled. And I think it's worth noting the extent to which these controls are in fact imposed upon citizens to an extent that is actually quite harmful. Let me give you first a very dramatic example of this, and then some less dramatic ones. The most dramatic one I can think of is the case of the United States, which between 1930 and 2000 deported 1 million of its own citizens, many of these native-born American citizens. Now, how could such a thing come about? Well, it came about because at various stages, America wanted workers, so they admitted people, mostly from Mexico, mostly by negotiation with the Mexican government to give them that freedom of movement across to fulfill needs in the labor market that they could not meet otherwise. But at various stages in America's history, it also then became anxious about too much Mexican immigration. And so they initiated sweeps of areas where Mexicans were thought to live and simply rounded them up and sent them back. Now, given that Mexicans have been a part of the United States since at least the early 1800s, when America acquired a good third of its existing territory by buying a part of Mexico and then conquering a part of Mexico. When it did so, it simply absorbed a large number of Mexicans. So many Mexicans have become Americans, but also many people who are of Mexican descent have lived in the United States all their lives and were born to parents who lived there all their lives. Well, when America decided that it was going to deport Mexicans, it therefore inadvertently deported 1 million people who looked like Mexicans. It also, I have to note, continues to do this, as does Britain, as does Australia, to deport its own citizens by mistake, mistaking people who are natives or citizens for outsiders. Every year, about 4,000 Americans are mistakenly deported. At any one time in the United States, at least 1% of the population in detention is American citizens. And the same is true in the European Union, which has hundreds of detention centers. And at any one time, at least 1% of that population is European Union citizens, not immigrants from outside. So immigration control, the more vigorously you pursue it, the more likely it is to endanger your own citizens. But let me give you a slightly less dramatic, but still, concerning example of this. In the United Kingdom, if you want to sponsor someone to move to the United Kingdom, you need an income of at least £18,000 to qualify as a sponsor. The consequence of this is that every year, about 18,000 UK citizens are denied the right to bring their spouse to the United Kingdom. People who are not able to bring not their relatives, but their husbands or wives to the United Kingdom because they don't make enough money to have the right to sponsor them. Over 10 years, that's nearly 200,000 people. And these people who are affected are, of course, not simply the immigrants, but the people who would be sponsors of their own partners. So the more vigorously you pursue immigration control, the more you risk undermining the freedoms and the rights of your own citizens. And again, I'm not talking here about ancient history, I'm talking about current circumstances. In a way, the real problem is that on the one hand, governments simply cannot do without outsiders because for all kinds of reasons, outsiders need to be brought in to the local society and of course, the local economy. But the problem is when people come in, they bring with them all kinds of problems from the government's point of view. On the one hand, they form attachments, which means if they leave or are forced to leave, they leave behind unhappy people. On the other hand, if you don't allow them in, you still have unhappy people for a variety of reasons, whether it's employers or simply human beings. Governments want workers, but they're worried about bringing in people. And if you want an analogy for this dilemma that they face, I can't think of a better one than the dilemma that was faced by the South African government in the years of apartheid, because that government decided, with much popular support, at least among the white population, that what it wanted to do was to preserve the integrity of white society and to keep the Black population apart, ultimately by pushing them off onto what they called homelands, the Bantustans. But the problem was they also needed the labor, and they weren't happy when Black Africans decided to try to go it on their own, setting up their own farms and businesses. So they made it more difficult for them by higher taxes until they drove them back into the white areas looking for work. And at that point, what governments tried to do was prevent them from associating with the local population, but at the same time, making sure that their labor was available. And this is essentially a strategy that I think the Western democracies in particular have deployed. They've wanted the labor, but they've not wanted the people. And so they've tried to negotiate this balance. In South Africa, they negotiated it by the policy of apartheid, which in itself also meant ultimately controlling not just the black population, but the white population, because there was always a danger that the white population would break the rules and fraternize with the black population. And this meant that for government, it was necessary both to monitor, surveil the white population and punish them if they moved away from the accepted rules. But furthermore, they also had to make sure they defended the ideology of apartheid. Western governments, while they repudiate apartheid and racism, have nonetheless been caught in the same dilemma. How do you bring in people, or rather, how do you bring in workers, but not bring in people? And as you can guess, is something that I think simply cannot be achieved. There's another price that they pay as a result of this. The problem is that if then you try to deal with the dilemmas that arise out of the tendency of people to move and the tendency of your citizens to engage with outsiders, the problem is that you won't meet your immigration targets. And so you will be tempted, as governments always are, to try to get around the law. And let me give you an example through the very strange and somewhat amusing story of Mr. Egon Kisch, who was a Prague-born national in Europe before Czechoslovakia existed, who became a strong anti-Nazi journalist, and he was therefore suspected wrongly of being a communist. But he nonetheless continued his anti-Nazi activity, and so was invited by the Australian peace movement in Melbourne in the 1930s to come and give a talk. Well, the Australian government heard about him and put out a note saying that he was not to be allowed onto the country. So when he arrived in Perth, he was stuck on the ship. Of course, the peace movement got very agitated about this, started a campaign to allow him to come. And by the time the ship moved to Melbourne, there was a huge groundswell of popular interest in Mr. Kisch, who was so excited by this that he jumped off the boat and broke his leg. This began a series of processes where he and the peace movement appealed to the courts to allow him to stay, which the courts did, saying that it was illegal to forbid him to stay, at which point the government deployed the infamous dictation test. Australia had a special test for anyone it wanted to exclude. You were asked to take a dictation test in a language, often a language that was not your own, and if you failed, you were not allowed to enter the country. Well, Mr. Kisch was fluent in several languages, and he kept passing these tests until they gave him a test in the language of Scottish Gaelic, which he failed because that was one language he didn't know. But then subsequently, the courts ruled that Scottish Gaelic was not a European language, so the case fell apart, and Mr. Kisch was allowed to stay. The government by this stage was completely humiliated and agreed to drop all charges, provided that he left, which he agreed to do, but not until there was a midnight parade in his honor through the streets of Melbourne. Now, what this case illustrates is the extent to which a government will go to get around the law, to get around due process in order to get its way, because what will stand in its way is, in fact, the rule of law, the regulations, the norms, and indeed the attitudes of the population of its country. The danger of immigration control is that the more seriously it's pursued, the more likely it is that governments will be tempted to get around the law in order to meet targets they cannot otherwise meet. And if you think about this, for example, by considering the United States right now, it has supposedly about 12 million so-called illegal immigrants. Well, in order to deport all of these people, right now, the US has the capacity to do so legally at the rate of about 400,000 people a year. So if you do the math, that'll take about 25 years to deport them all, provided nobody comes back in. So it's going to take you a very, very long time. You've either got to increase the amount of money you spend, that means more money on courts, lawyers, police, detention centers, and so on, or you try to get around this by less legal means. So the real danger to the rule of law with immigration control is that it tempts governments to become desperate to go around the law. The more it sets immigration targets, the more it finds itself out of touch with the community, various parts of which are interested in associating with immigrants, the more it tends to side with one part of the society against the other, and the more it ends up bending the law in order to get its way. So immigration control is something that is a matter of concern to us. I would go so far as to say much more of a concern or a worry than immigration itself. But now, what are the counter arguments? Couldn't someone say, well, that's all true, but maybe it's worth it all the same because there are economic benefits to controlling immigration, and it helps us protect our culture. And ultimately, it means that we will end up in control of our own country. Let me address each of these concerns individually, beginning with the economics of immigration. And I'll go through this quite quickly because time is limited, but we can come to this in the Q&A if you wish. Firstly, on the economics of immigration, there are two aspects to the claim that immigration is economically harmful. One is that it's bad for a society's wealth and income. And the other is that immigration tends to benefit some at the expense of others. So the distribution of the gains from immigration are not equal or proportionate. So let me deal first with the question of the impact of immigration on wealth and income in a country. Now here I think one thing is fairly clear. Most economists think that immigration has a positive effect on the economic well-being of a country. The difficulty is that measuring this impact is a tricky thing. Economists everywhere simply don't agree on how you assess the impact of immigration on national income or on national wealth. The most well-known critic of immigration, who's an immigration economist here, is a man called George Borjas, who wrote a book called Immigration Economics, which is a very technical work, and a more popular one called We Wanted Workers. Now, even he, who is quite critical of immigration and critical of the defenders of immigration, concedes that immigration, in fact, has very little, if any, negative impact on the wealth or income of a country. At most, he says, what's happened is that the advocates of more freedom of immigration have overstated the benefits of immigration, which may be benefits that come in quite a long way into the future, but are not immediate. Very, very few economists disagree with this. Some simply go further to say, no, the gains from immigration in economic terms are even greater than Borjas has acknowledged. But the bigger issue is the distributional question. Here, the argument is, well, of course, immigration is beneficial, but some people benefit more than others. In fact, the rich benefit more than the poor. Now, is this the case? Well, there is something to this argument, although the margins here are actually quite small. It is true that in countries of the developed West, some people benefit more than others. In one sense, of course, any immigrant coming into a country who takes a job that might have been held by by a native is disadvantaging that particular native. But here, what one has to bear in mind is that this is not enough for us to understand the impact of immigration, because the immigrant in question is substituting for the native who's not getting that job. But of course, many immigrants are not simply there because they are substitutes for other potential workers. They're there actually because they complement other workers. That is to say, they have skills, they have assets that make it possible to employ other workers, because without the skills of that immigrant, certain things couldn't be done that would generate further employment. So not all immigration substitutes for the labor of domestic workers. Most immigrants are in fact people who affect natives in both of these ways, taking their jobs, but also making possible more jobs. Overall, the net impact is an increase in the availability of employment. Those who are most likely to be disadvantaged are those who are high school dropouts, who suffer a slight drop in level of pay to about 5% less than they would otherwise make, and also the previous generation of immigrants. They do a little bit worse, although their claims are a little bit compromised since they presumably reduce the income of the previous generation of immigrants. Excuse me.
So, Professor, we have 10 minutes before we go to the Q&A.
I've just got another couple of slides, if that's okay, Brian. So one other thing that, however, is worth noticing here is that the extent to which the poorest members of a society are disadvantaged, from the perspective of the nationalist who thinks that what we should do above all is protect the worst of the poorest nationals from the impact of immigration. Here, I might just ask the following question. If we accept, as most economists do, that the impact of immigration in the long run is an improvement in the wealth and income of the nation, then the next generation of poor will be better off as a result of immigration. If you want to emphasize the importance of protecting nationals, why, I ask, is it important to protect current nationals rather than future nationals? Why are future nationals sacrificed in the interest of the present? Now, let me turn then to the arguments from culture. There are those who want to say that we need to limit immigration in order to protect the integrity of a culture. I'll go a little bit more quickly over this, but I want to raise a particular dilemma that, or two dilemmas that face the defender of immigration control on the basis of culture. The first is, how do you define the culture? Whose culture are you talking about? If you want to say that we as a society have a very, very particular, thick, substantial conception of culture, that means that you're all going to have to agree on what that culture is. But if there is diversity within your society, then those who don't fall under your definition are themselves going to be at a disadvantage and are going to be treated unequally. But if you say, no, no, we have a conception of culture that's very broad, that can encompass all the diversity in our society, then it's not clear how welcoming immigrants is going to dilute your culture in any way. And this, in fact, also gives us an egalitarian dilemma. If you want to treat your people equally, as you surely will with all your citizens, then controlling immigration by saying, well, we're only going to admit those people who fit in culturally is going to mean treating your own citizens unequally to the extent that they are culturally diverse. And then let me conclude by just looking at the argument that says we need immigration control because we want to determine our future for ourselves. And here what I want to point out, and it varies country to country, but particularly in the countries of the liberal democratic West, the problem with this argument is that it actually assumes something that's not defensible. Firstly, that there is in fact a shared conception of what the nation is and what the self is. If you took Britain, for example, take into account the Scottish nationalists or the people of Ireland or the people of Wales who consider themselves to be separate nations, arguing that there is a single self is problematic. But the other thing to consider is simply that immigration control is actually not simply a matter of we or us or the population taking control. It's a matter of governments exercising control. And even then, not exercising control on their own, because the immigration control regime is not a national regime, it's an international one. Immigration globally is not controlled by local populations, it's controlled by global political institutions who make the regulations that govern international travel, international movement of people, and international immigration. If you think that immigration control means self-determination, it's really not for you as an individual citizen whose self is getting back in control. What you're really doing is you're ceding much more control to your governments, and ultimately that government is ceding much more control than it imagines to the rest of the world. Why would one think this is self-determination, and why would one think it's a good idea? Let me leave it at that, although there's much more to say, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. So we are now going to the Q&A session. Please drop all your questions in the Q&A box below, and I will select them and read them out to the professor. Okay, I'm gonna pick a question here by Mr. Haniel Lim here. Professor, I'm going to read it out. He says, "Hi, Professor Kukathas. I was wondering whether you think there are certain cases where collective action may be desirable for immigration. Labor from certain places may be cheap, so there are a lot of workers coming for economic reasons. However, in some cases, an excessive influx may undo the very culture of toleration that welcomes immigrants in the first place. Would it not then be better to force individuals to give up the short-term economic gains of foreign labor in order to sustain long-term social, political, and economic institutions?"
That's a very good question. And I think really this is a question that has to be examined empirically. And I'm very interested in this question. So I've looked for examples of this happening, and I simply don't find any. So there's no empirical evidence to support this worry. But of course, one has to ask, is there any example of a massive influx of immigrants so that we could study to see whether it's destabilizing? So let me give you one such example, which is the movement of East Germans into West Germany when East and West reunified in 1991. Now, if you know anything about the history of communism, you'll recall that the Germanys were separated from 1945 to 1991 because East Germany was ruled under the Soviet bloc. And so it developed a quite distinct set of cultural attitudes. It had a society that was under constant surveillance. It had an anti-capitalist mentality that was created by the regime over a period of 50 years. It had an economy that more or less collapsed. Many of its enterprises had negative value. And so when Germany reunited, not only did it welcome 16 million, in fact, immigrants, but also millions of people literally moved from east to west in 3 or 4 years. Now, what happened to Germany? Well, you could say in one sense, it changed culturally over a period of the last 20 years. It did have all kinds of of problems of absorbing people whose attitudes were ones of resentment in many ways. But at the same time, Germany has prospered economically. In that time, it has become the powerhouse of Europe. Its norms of freedom and toleration have, if anything, spread into the eastern parts of Germany, albeit imperfectly. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I don't want to say that there are no problems in Germany. Every country has its problem, but it's a very dramatic case, and it's also coincides with a period when Germany accepted thousands, in fact, millions of refugees when it declared itself a refugee and immigrant welcoming country. So if you add all of those, it's closer to 20 million people who moved into Germany over about 10 years. But the effect there was not anything like what one might have feared. Of course, one also has to ask the question when looking at problems that have arisen in Germany since then, when there are problems, to what extent are these problems that are the result of immigration? And to what extent are these problems that have had multiple causes, from the fiscal problems that the European Union has to a whole range of other issues. But looking at this particular case, I just couldn't find any evidence that the theoretical problem that you correctly identify is in fact an actual problem. If we ever get to a point where we suddenly do find there are so many people coming into place that they are causing difficulties, then I think we should look at it. Certainly, it's not something we should just ignore. But for the moment, it's not something that keeps me awake at night.
But Professor, what do you think about, in contemporary Europe today, where nationalists are complaining about the influx of refugees and people from Middle Eastern countries, maybe from Muslim countries who may import illiberal values, undermine democratic norms and culture, for example, in the country of Turkey, for example?
Mm-hmm. Well, it says again, you couldn't have more illiberal and anti-democratic norms than you had in East Germany, because that is what they were not only brought up with, but they were brought up to explicitly repudiate the capitalist West. Now, most immigrants coming in from other parts of the world, like the Middle East, are in fact not anti-capitalist, but in fact quite the reverse. The ones who want to move are in fact the ones who are most attracted by the West and Western values. It's very, very unusual to find among immigrants actually people who just want to move, for example, for the sake of welfare. Most of them want to move because they want to get ahead economically. So a recent report in the New York Times this last week about the impact of the movement of 1.2 million Syrians that were let in by Angela Merkel suggests that actually most of them have found jobs, most of them have learned German, most of them have assimilated. Of course, a good many haven't as well. There's no denying the problem, but none of the difficulties that have eventuated or that have been anticipated have really eventuated. So I think it's a theoretical problem, but we've yet to see an example in the empirical evidence that makes us think this is an actual problem.
Right. Okay, great. So next question by Soradip Bhattacharya. She says, I was wondering about your views of granting residential rights to immigrants or refugees, but making it conditional on whether they attend and pass a re-education program on Western progressive and liberal values, as is being done with refugees in Sweden, Norway, and other Nordic countries. So it is found that after passing the test and being granted asylum, and if they have not adhered to these values, then will deportation be justified?
Yeah. I think this could set up a very tricky problem for most societies. I'm not sure about Sweden so much, but let's say that you try to do that in the United States or the United Kingdom. In the US in particular, given how divided the society is, I think you're going to have a tough time agreeing on what those values are. Just think about the divided nature of the United States as exhibited by the by the last election, you're going to have to come to a decision about what is the right set of values. And in a diverse society, these are hotly debated. The other thing, of course, to note is that one of the crucial things about the values of countries like Sweden, for example, is preeminent among these things that are valued is freedom of thought and freedom of speech. So in proposing that people take a test about what they believe, you're actually going against a fundamental strain of the liberal democratic tradition. You can do it, but it seems to me to be very ironic that you would be proposing such a test. And I would imagine that any Swedish national who was asked to take a test like that, even if there were no penalty, would object strenuously and would say, I'm a free Swedish citizen and I have the right to believe what I believe, to think what I think and say what I say.
Right, okay. Next question by Marcos de Souza. Hello, Professor. Would you have any thoughts on the European Union's concept of freedom of movement?
Well, I admire the European Union's view that its internal borders should remain open. And it's maintained that to a substantial degree, but not perfectly, because while the UK was a part of the EU, it was not part of the Schengen Agreement that allowed freedom of movement internally. It was let to cross borders and go through passport control on entering and leaving the UK. But still, I accept that the EU is broadly in favor of freedom of movement internally. And its success in that, I think, is very instructive because it shows you can have freedom of movement without everybody having to worry about people moving from poor countries into rich ones or from one culture into the next in such large numbers that the whole thing falls apart. People have to have reasons to move. So I think all the gains have been substantial and there's been very little negative consequence. On the other hand, what has been noted about the EU's views about free movement is that it doesn't extend to people outside the EU. So it's only freedom of internal movement. So in a sense, it's just become a bit like the United States, where Americans can move freely on their own territory, but outsiders are controlled. And to the extent that the EU wants to prevent outsiders from entering, then it has had to develop a system that exhibits all the pathologies of a regime of immigration control. And in particular, that means that it's set up checkpoints in various parts of the EU within 100 kilometers of all the EU borders. There are patrols who stop people at random to see whether they've broken laws. Mostly they're stopping citizens. They have several hundred detention centers, which contain a good number of European citizens who've been wrongly detained, as well as large numbers of would-be immigrants, both legal and illegal, who are wrongly detained. So I think what I would say about the EU is that it's good in some respects, not so good in others.
Right, okay, next question by KL Chu. Do you think that countries have preferences for certain races over others? President Trump was very uncomplimentary about immigrants, legal or illegal, of Latino ancestry, whilst the Windrush generation of West Indies migrants who migrated to the UK under the right to stay rule in the 1940s to 60s seem to have been especially targeted by the British Home Office, unlike Asian immigrants who came over under the same rules at the same time too.
So there are two separate things to consider here. One is the extent to which the population is full of people who have racial preferences, and the other is the extent to which the governments of these countries, whether the United States or the United Kingdom, have race-based preferences. Now, it's fairly clear that there are some people in any of these countries who have race-based preferences about immigrants. But all of these countries of the liberal democratic West have public philosophies and institutions which repudiate racism and therefore racially biased selection. So the dilemma for governments, therefore, is how to stick to the liberal democratic norms that they profess while not antagonizing those people, and I don't know what proportion they would be of any specific country, those people who want racially shaped immigration selection. Now, that said, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and many others in the world have consistently made racial identity a part of their decision-making in coming to determine who may or may not enter or may not become a citizen. Now here the story is a little bit more complicated than it appears, because the first thing to remember is that there's no such thing as race as a natural category. If you look at the peoples of the world, they shade into one kind or another very, very gradually. You know, if you go to the Middle East and to Africa, you'll see different shades, you'll see subtle differences of language as you move from one region to another, but it's very difficult to say at this point someone becomes this particular kind of racial type. And that's even without thinking about centuries of intermarriage. So what has made us classify people in this way into different races and sub-races and so on? Well, there are many factors at work, but one of those factors is in fact immigration control. Immigration control has led to the creation of racial categories. Did you know, for example, that there was no such category as Asian until 1920? It was a term invented by American legislation when they had to decide how they were going to categorize people when they decided that they were going to have an immigration policy based on nationality. At that point, it was clear that you could not move into a country if you were not, or become a citizen if you were not white. But even that caused a problem because they didn't know what was and what was not white. They knew that African slaves were not white, but what about Punjabis? And what about people who are Parsis, like the parents of Freddie Murphy? Well, in fact, the Supreme Court said that the Parsis were white, but the Punjabis were not. And so over the course of a number of years, the Supreme Court made numerous decisions that tried to establish racial categories. South Africa did the same thing. When it tried to control the movement of Black populations, it started establishing racial categories. First blacks, coloreds, and whites, and then they added Indians, and then they added various subgroups because they needed to control the movement of the population. Then they needed to figure out how you determine whether someone was white. And they couldn't use biological inheritance because there were too many whites who had some Black ancestry. So they went by appearance. But that didn't work because some siblings were one dark-skinned and one light-skinned. So it all turned into a bit of a mess. Immigration is also a factor that has shaped racial categorization. So the problem is really quite a complicated one. But as I said, you've still got the problem of what you're going to do about those people who want immigration control on the basis of race. And governments have tried to respond to those, but they also then make their own assumptions about races. For example, with the people from the Caribbean versus the people from Asia that the question mentions. Well, in around 1970, the British government decided that it was very worried about all these Asian men coming in to work in the United Kingdom, and they were worried that they might intermarry with the white population. So they set up a visa scheme to allow Asian women to move quickly to join people in the UK using a visa called the fiancé visa. But then they became worried that people would use the fiancé visa, not because they were coming to marry Indian men, stop them marrying white Brits, but that they were just going to use this to come into the country anyway. So they started a process of virginity testing on arrival to see whether the women were virgins. Completely crazy, because there's no way of testing such a thing. But they also decided that they didn't need to test the Caribbean people, because the Caribbean people were more sexually promiscuous anyway. So, the chances are they weren't virgins. All actually kind of offensive, but the imperative to make judgments about races led to decisions of all kinds about what categorizes or characterizes a race. And many of these things constantly get reified in laws and understandings, which have all kinds of knock-on consequences. So the idea of racial classification as a means of immigration control is fraught with a lot of difficulties. Sorry, Brian, you're muted.
So we have a bunch of questions on Singapore. So Sim Zixuan asks, hi, Professor, do you feel that there is no consensus on a coherent Singaporean identity?
Well, I think if that's being asked by a Singaporean, which I suspect it is, then that's probably correct. But I don't think Singapore would be unique in that respect. I think that's the case with most countries. But I'd actually like to raise a slightly different and prior question, which is actually, what does one mean by the idea of a national identity? So to some extent, there are countries which want to claim that there is a natural national identity that's given by the country's history. And so, all we have to do is look to the past in order to establish it. And all kinds of people have made this claim, but it's turned out to be very difficult to sustain because the past is complicated. There are different streams that crisscross, and historians disagree, and the citizens generally disagree about the past. So it's difficult. In the case of Singapore, that past is very complicated because this region has a long history going back, centuries, if not more than 1,000 years, where there have been different empires. And Singapore was a place within those structures until the British came along and then changed things in a dramatic way to create, the Strait settlements that made Singapore a part of a region that could eventually have become Malaysia, and did for a while. And then now it's all changed again. So you can't really say, well, we can pluck this clearly out of the past. Perhaps we ought to create one. And I think the Singapore government has a very clear understanding that this is an important thing to do, to create a national identity. The fact that it's still doing this actively suggests that maybe it hasn't succeeded yet. Maybe in time, people will feel that there is a national identity. It's one that everybody shares. But who knows what will happen in the future. It also makes one wonder if everyone stops debating the question of whether there's a national identity. Does that mean now that there is one, or does it mean that there isn't one? I'm not sure how one would interpret this.
So another question on Singapore by Gabriel. Hi, Professor, how can immigrants successfully assimilate or integrate into Singapore society? Should the Singapore state continue to differentially treat low-skilled and high-skilled migrants, for example, issuing policies that attract skilled migrants that make it easy for them to settle down, but not really doing the same for low-skilled migrants?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I've been thinking a lot about this. So one thing I admire about the way the Singapore government has treated its migrant workers is that it's certainly showed them a level of care, and it's given them some recognition as making a contribution to the society. I remember when the PM in the first phase of the lockdown, when he addressed the nation, spoke explicitly to the migrant workers and said, we will protect your livelihoods, we will make sure you can send money home, and we recognize the contribution that you're making. I thought that was very admirable. On the other hand, for them, there's also no path to citizenship, there's no path to integration. So they're really being treated very unequally and differently from those, say, like myself, who've come here as more skilled and well-paid immigrants. I can't help feeling that this is very good for me, but unfair on the others. What is the basis for doing this? I can see that there may be some advantage for Singaporeans because you're getting a lot of low-skill labor. I can see an disadvantage for those immigrants because they wouldn't be coming here unless it was worth their while. It may look like it's low pay to us, but clearly for them, it's better than anything they can get elsewhere. But still, from the perspective of Singapore society, one has to ask, even if we're doing good for these other immigrants, is this the kind of society Singapore wants to be? One that treats people as unequally as this? I think it's a dilemma for Singaporeans.
So one of the last few questions, a general one by Marcos de Souza. How would you define the relationship between capitalism and freedom of immigration?
Very good question. I don't think that there is a straightforward relationship between these two things. Firstly, let me just observe that many non-capitalist countries, although a lot's going to turn on how much you think that this is capitalism, have accepted far more immigrants and especially refugees than the strongest capitalist democracies. Think, for example, of Iran and Turkey, which are maybe, let's say, highly interventionist capitalist societies, have taken in millions of refugees. So that's the kind of immigration policy, but it's not particularly one that you would associate with a capitalist state. But as I said, it's also a matter of degree. I mean, one thing is clear if you think about the countries of the communist world, or the former communist world. They are hostile both to immigration and emigration. The Soviet Union and China for a long time simply prevented their societies from leaving. But in the case of China, as it's become more capitalist and it's allowed its citizens to travel more freely, it's still much more closed as far as outsiders are concerned. And I think ultimately the reason may be that, what's crucial is not so much the economic system as the kind of political society that you are. If you're a liberal democracy, you're much more likely to enjoy freedom of movement. If you're a society in which control is much more important, especially political control, you're much more likely also to control the movement of people. Yeah.
Right, okay, I'm just going to end with one last question from myself. So you have presented a very skeptical view against immigration control and showing how it could actually even risk undermining liberal democracy, how it can undermine the freedoms that we cherish. So for you, is there ever a reason or a case for immigration control? When is the most justifiable occasion for the government to control immigration?
So as I mentioned at the beginning, when you think about immigration control, we're talking not just about controlling borders, but also about controlling what people do once they've entered a society. So to the extent that it's about controlling what people do once they've entered a society, I think there's really very little justification for it, because I don't see any economic benefits. I don't see any security benefits. I don't see any cultural benefits. Think about it in this way. Okay? Each year in the United Kingdom, 30 million visitors enter the country. Okay? Now, only a tiny percentage of those have the right to work, have the right to rent, to have the right to do all kinds of things. Now, if you're worried about the cultural impact of people, then you're allowing all these people in, as well as allowing their ideas and the ideas that come in through the internet and television and so on, which is having a tremendous cultural impact. If you think that you need to control people in order to limit their cultural impact, then it doesn't seem like it's actually a viable strategy, and controlling immigration is not going to do much for you. The same is true for the economic consequences. So, so then we come to the question of whether there's a case for controlling the borders for immigration at the point of entry. And the only case I can think of is one that's illustrated by the pandemic. There may be times when you need to close your border for reasons of controlling something like a pandemic. But of course, what we've seen in this is that there's nothing actually specifically distinctive about your national borders. Because to control a pandemic, you may well need to control movements between cities, movement between suburbs, movements between houses. Well, this is in a condition of crisis. And of course, what everybody wants is to go back to where we were before, to live as human beings who can move freely within our homes, within our neighborhoods, within our cities, within our countries, and ideally across the world.
Right, okay. With that, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the webinar. Definitely do check out the professor's book on Amazon called Immigration and Freedom. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Feel free to contact us at the Adam Smith Center for more content like this. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everyone.